Today what I really want to do is emphasize what we have done this past year. As many of you know, 2013 is about to come to an end. This is the last Sunday of 2013. And one of the things that I like to do is actually kind of take time and be still and think about some of the things that God has done through us. For us, I know as part of human nature, it's easy for us to be really negative and to dwell on the negative. I was watching the news the other day, which said the newscasters were even admitting most of the year we actually just spend most of the time just emphasizing the negative. And they were saying that. And so one of the things that I thought about was sometimes we do that, even in the church, where sometimes it's easy to go about our year and just think about all the bad things that happen. But one of the things that we're taught throughout Scripture is learning to be thankful, taking time to meditate and dwell on what God has done for us and through us in order to accomplish His will and His glory. And so one of the great things that I thought about was this is one of the characteristics that great people of the Bible did. That even though they suffered hardship and struggle, they always took time to give God the glory and worship Him and thank Him. We even read through the Psalms of David. David went through so many bad things in his life. And he would sometimes have these prayers and these psalms of laments and depression and struggle. But he would always come back and say, God, thank you for what you've done for me. And I just thought, that is a mature attitude. Because we know that sometimes we're going to go through hard things. We're going to have struggles. We're going to struggle and feel down at times. But sometimes if we take a step back and just reflect on what God has done, then we can be thankful. Joe did a really good job this morning reading from 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, where Paul tells us to pray continuously and to give thanks, for that is God's will for us. God's will for us is to pray and be thankful to Him. Did you ever realize that? That we should be thankful. That's what God wills. And one of the things that I realize is when God's people are thankful, that influences the way we think. It influences us to think about who God is and what He has done. And when we really think about all the things that God has done for us, that starts to change completely how we choose to live life. It changes our attitude, changes our mindset. And so one of the things that I thought about was I want us to emphasize the positive and think about what has God done for us in 2013. Because oftentimes we think, oh, we're a smaller congregation, maybe we didn't do a whole lot of this or that, but I can tell you, we've done so much more than we have actually thought. You see, one of the things that I've said before is it's easy to be negative and think about what the church isn't or hasn't done, and we obviously know we aren't there yet, and we're growing and we're maturing and we're desiring to be the church that God has called us to be, to do the things God has called us to do. And one of the things that I look at is sometimes it's good for us to undergo struggles and trials and temptations. And in fact, the book of James tells us to have pure joy when those things happen. And oftentimes when we look at our congregation, sometimes we can think about some of those negative things. We can think about the struggles, the hardships, the things that maybe didn't go right. But sometimes I think, you know what? Sometimes those are blessings in and of themselves. And the reason why those are blessings is because sometimes when God's people are growing and stretching themselves and taking risks of faith, sometimes you're going to fall flat on your face. Sometimes things won't turn out the way you want. But the fact is, that shows that we're trying to grow. That shows that we're trying to mature. You see, Satan doesn't attack churches that aren't effective or aren't trying to grow. And in fact, he allows them to live in the comfort of their own self-deception, that they're actually doing something. But when God's people start doing things, that's when Satan starts to attack. Because he gets afraid of the kingdom of light, because we know that we're attacking the kingdom of darkness when we start doing the things that He has called us to do. And so one of the things that I think about is, I want us to think about all the hardships and struggles that we've gone through, but realize, you know what, maybe that's just a sign that we're actually starting to do the things that God has called us to do. Persecution always comes when God's people start to rise up. Persecution and hardship always comes when God's people start taking risks of faith. Satan always attacks when God's people start getting in their mindset, we want to do God's will and live for His glory. And we know sometimes that's going to make people feel uncomfortable. It's going to be something that's hard to understand. Sometimes It's fearful because we're taking risks of faith. But this is where we start dwelling on who God is and what He has done. You see, one of the things that we learn about human nature is that we're forgetful and sometimes we're a little dumb. I'm one of those people. But one of the things that God has taught us throughout Scripture is to take time and to dwell on Him, dwell on what He's done, and be thankful. And in fact, God has throughout Scripture has shown us that setting up memorials and taking time to remember Him is so important. We took part in the Lord's Supper, and we do that each week because we need to remember, hey, Jesus died, buried, and rose again, and that confirms the hope and the salvation that we have. Do you need that reminder each week? I know I do. It's easy for me to get busy with the priorities of life and just forget, but when I come to the table, I just remember. Even in the people in the book of Exodus, when they're about to leave Egypt, God implemented the Passover. And this was a meal in which they were to take, and when God's people and their children asked them, what is this all about? The parents were supposed to teach them, we take part in this Passover because this is how when God passed over His people, and He brought that punishment among Egypt so that Pharaoh would set God's people free. And so that they would take that time and just remember who God is and what He had done. And so they had that annual reminder. One of the great passages of Scripture that I think about is in Joshua chapter 4. In Joshua chapter 4, this is the time where Joshua is now leading the new generation of Israelites. The people that would actually go into the promised land. The prior generation was freed from Egyptian bondage, but they remained in the wilderness because they complained and grumbled against God. But this next generation would be zealous for the Lord and eager to follow God and trust in Him in faith. And they would walk into the promised land, and as we know the story, they would walk around the walls of Jericho, and the walls would fall down, and Joshua would lead his people to conquer it. And then the promised land would be given to them, the promise fulfilled to Abraham. But one of the things that God commanded Joshua to do before they would enter into the promised land and conquer the land was to set up a memorial of 12 stones, having each tribe as leader grab a stone and set it down as a pillar. And when the children of Israel saw that, they would ask, what do these stones represent? And then the parents would make known to them, this is when God dried up the Jordan so that our people could cross it. Just like how Moses did in the Red Sea. And in this was the beginning of the fulfillment of that promised land. And so I want to read this real quick because I want us to understand that it's good for us to take time each year, to just take time and think about the positives, the things that God has done for us. Because when we do that, we can think, yeah, God is working among us. God is using us for His glory. We are growing and we are offending Satan. And we're going to take this momentum and bring it into the next year. And we're going to grow even more. We're going to glorify God even more. We're going to grow closer together even more. God is going to use us and make a difference. But in Joshua chapter 4, verse 21 through 24, it shows us the power of remembering God, but also the purpose for it. In Joshua chapter 4, verse 21 through 24, it says this. He said to the Israelites, in the future when your descendants ask their fathers, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what He had done to the Red Sea when He dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. You see, they were to take these stones and to remember. And part of that was so that they would remember this event that God was going to do. And this event was going to make known to all the nations, this is the one true God. This is the powerful God. This is the God who has a covenant with His people and fulfills His promises to His people. And He is so mighty and powerful. And in that, they would fear God. We often have this misunderstanding of fearing God. We ought to fear God because He's God. But as we know from Scripture, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It's the beginning of knowledge. And one of the things that we understand is when we take